back to our second conversation about the book of Exodus. As you've already probably figured out, there is very much in the book of Exodus to think about and to digest. It is a spectacular drama. We continue this program to focus on just 3 areas that take place in the book of Exodus. The first is the great escape. The water, the clouds, the fire. And then we're going to loop back just for a second to the Passover. The second area is the desert journey and the grumbling of the Hebrew people. And the third area is the covenant that God makes with his people. And so let's talk a little bit about that great escape. I'm sure that you often feel that you are in a hurry. It seems to me that there is a sense of urgency about everything in our lives today. Some of us, when we are in such a situation, we will sit down and will attempt to plan out every moment down to the smallest detail, only to get even more anxious when we realize the amount of time that we're spending trying to write things down. Some people just toss up their hands in despair and simply try to march through the weeds, doing the best that they can do, or maybe not even the best that they can do. There are others who have mastered the art of being in the present moment, while also in the midst of chaos. Now imagine the Israelites running out of captivity, at least in my mind they're running away from captivity, not able to bring a whole lot of stuff with them, ordered by Moses to follow him, but not really knowing where they're going. And imagine the Egyptians with their chariots and their swords and their shields are chasing you, and they're not really all that far behind you. Imagine yourself in the midst of this massive migration of people, all in the same boat as you are, free from their captors, but anxious that the captors are going to be able to catch up with them. And suddenly you find yourself at the Sea of Reeds. And Moses is telling you that God has spoken to him and the people will be safe. Some skepticism here might have been appropriate on the part of the former slaves. At the banks of the Sea of Reeds, the Israelites get angry with God and angry with Moses. Was it because there were no more graves in Egypt that you brought us out here in the desert to die? They asked. It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. But here's the marvelous thing, the mysterious thing. Throughout the chaos, God has been with the Israelites, leading them by day with a pillar of cloud, and leading them by night with a pillar of fire. And then Moses raises his arms, and the waters part, and he encourages the people to walk through the divided waters onto dry land. And they did, with walls of water on either side of them. And they looked back, and they could see the Egyptians starting to enter the water. But they also noticed that the pillar of fire remained before them and led them, and that the pillar of cloud had moved to the back of the crowd of former slaves. The pillar of cloud separated the light ahead of the Israelites from the darkness that now overshadowed the Egyptians. And soon all of the Israelites were on the other side of the sea, and the Egyptians were drowned in the sea, and the people of God lifted their voices and sang, "I will sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. The horse and its rider he has hurled into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my song. He has become my salvation." God was with them in cloud and in fire. God was with them. And with that, the Israelites embark on a long journey through a desert to a land promised to them. And the people will be experiencing many times over the coming years Passover moments as they walk through one trial or one tribulation after another. what about our own Passover moments in life? In our daily lives, we often find ourselves with many things about which we might need to pass over. Francis Dorff calls it practicing the art of passing over. And here, Dorff suggests that our lives are filled with things and with people, ideas and values, perhaps, about which we may need to let go and move beyond. He comments that we begin to realize that the Passover is actually being celebrated wherever and whenever anyone is practicing the art of passing over, by letting go in trust, letting go in hope, and letting go in love. Where is God for us? Where are the pillars of fire and cloud that God provides to you and to me as we experience moments of passing over, as we go through our own moments of exodus? Our second point to consider is the desert journey itself and the grumbling of the Hebrew people. Now, the Israelites were pretty happy to be leaving captivity in Egypt. They trusted this man named Moses, who claimed that the one true God was going to lead them to a promised land. They trusted that this God was going to care for them. But after 3 days in the desert without water, they weren't happy campers anymore. And so they cried out, "If only we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots and ate our fill of bread. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly from hunger." They were grumpy. But just as God had paid attention to their suffering when they were slaves in Egypt, God now heard their grumbling. And God said to Moses, "Go to the people and say to them, I have heard the complaining. I have heard the complaining of the Israelites. Say to them, at twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall have your fill of bread, and then you shall know that I am the Lord your God." God also gave instructions for exactly how much they could gather. However, the Israelites didn't quite follow the rules. Some gathered more than they needed for one day. Others presumed that if they ran out, they could always gather more on the Sabbath day, which God had already strictly prohibited. Moses had to intervene to ensure that the people ate only what was directed. And we learned in the last part of chapter 16 of Exodus that the Israelites ate manna for 40 years. God did as God promised. God fed them. Myers notes that the restrictions about the manna were actually a test, and that clearly obedience to God does not come easily to this people, despite the wonders and the miracles that they have experienced. But God does not abandon them, even despite their disobedience. The people come to know, as Myers says, that the powerful God who can perform the miracle of the sea is also a nurturing deity who can provide sweet water and now delectable food where neither had existed before. Where does God provide that sweet water and the delectable food for you in the midst of your own Exodus moments? Chapter 24 of Exodus, we come to that time when the people of Israel, these Hebrew wanderers, are being invited into covenant with the Holy One. Chapter 24 is filled with drama and mystery. Here, the Holy One calls to Moses and invites him first to the edge of the mountain, and then to come farther up the mountain with the others. And finally, the Holy One tells the others to leave, so that only Moses and the Holy One remain. You can read the story that evolves in this chapter. but take the time to experience and appreciate the holy mystery that unfolds within it. The actual covenant with the Holy One is established as God and the Hebrew people enter into a promise. God promises to be their God, and the people promise to be faithful to the commandments that God has set down for them. God promises to be ever present to these people if they honor him and if they honor their sister and their brother Hebrews. It is that simple, and yet it is that difficult. The Holy One often expects much faith and hope from the people, and the people often get frustrated with God. There is much push and pull between God and the people. The people rejoice when things are going well, such as when water and food is available, but they become quite frustrated with God when there is no food or water. Golden Gate notes that when God does something new and creative, like providing manna from the sky and water from the rock, it's tempting to think that everything from this point forward is going to be wonderful. The Ten Commandments, however, demonstrate that the Creator realized that people, being human, are going to need some kind of rule of life so that they can know when it is that they might be veering away from the covenant that they made with God. Our covenant is all about lives lived in community. Bloch, Brueggemann, and McKnight put it very simply. A covenant is not without risks. It demands reciprocity over time, and violating it has its consequences. For example, loss of trust and consequent isolation. Covenant is a different way of ordering social relationships. It leads to a more intimate, a more interdependent way of being. And so our covenant with God through Jesus is not about living faith in isolation, but it is about communities of faith living their faith through actions that strengthen the covenant and which causes the people in the covenant to build up communities of peace, justice, respect, and collaboration right where they find themselves day after day. We live in covenant together, not alone. And so we've made it to that point in the Exodus story where the Hebrew people have entered into a covenant with God and God with them. Their journey to the Promised Land continues to the end of that journey. Our journey, from this point forward, always continues as we try to live out the baptismal covenant which we have made within the community of the church. And so we must ask ourselves, how do we do that very thing? Thank you.